Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the third in our series of local authors reading, once a month series here at La Tienda. We're glad to see all of you. Tonight we have aspiring authors. We'll have 5 authors reading tonight, starting off with Destiny Allison, I love, Margaret Brawls, Deborah Dinker, Carrie Ishii, and then James
Postinas.
That's right. That was a test. There is a $2 suggested admission fee, which Sandy is collecting, if you will. And I think we'll get started right to it. First reader, Destiny Allison.
Okay, so you guys have to help me. I actually am not very good at talking without a mic, but I would prefer to do this without a mic. So if you can't hear me, can you just raise your hands?
Sure.
Okay, get up front, Obi, get up front. Are you serious, or are you okay? You joking? Okay. Good, but I'm going to do this way without the mic because I can move and I'm not quite as nervous. I am a little nervous. Steve is, I think, maybe the first man in the world who got a girlfriend with a instruction manual. I wrote this book about 10 years ago and have been tweaking it and working on it, until now. And it's getting ready to be published. It'll be out in February, which is very exciting. But this is my first public reading, so if I stutter and I'm nervous, bear with me, give me feedback afterwards. Please don't leave. The book is called Shaping Destiny. It's a quest for meaning in art and life. It's a nonfiction book, but it is not another memoir about a difficult life, and it's not a how-to for artists. What it does actually is take you on a journey through the creative process, the culmination of which is the understanding that our lives really are our greatest works of art. Before I get started tonight, I want to thank my mother. She's not here, and for good reason. The chapter that I'm going to be reading reveals some things about her that she was courageous enough to let me put in and to support this endeavor. Because while the book is about art, it is also very much about issues that are particularly relevant to women. I think that we are often taught who we're supposed to be at a very young age, and we go through life expecting that that's who we're going to be. We do our best to make it work, and then we find ourselves in really difficult situations where who we're supposed to be doesn't line up with who we are, and we put ourselves in situations that can be pretty dangerous for us. There aren't any children in the audience, but I will tell you that the book has some adult, this chapter has a little bit of adult content, not a lot. And then finally, because we're launching in February, we are going to be throwing a kick-ass celebration party, and we really hope that you guys will come. There's an email sign-up list on the table over there, although we forgot a pen. Stephen will need to find some. So if you want to come to the party, please put your name on the invitation over there. Lastly, the book has a kind of unusual format. There's a teaching voice that goes all the way through the manuscript, and each chapter is preceded by a class lesson that can be taken both literally in terms of making art or metaphorically for life. And we'll start there. This is chapter 5, lesson 5. Every sculptural form consists of 2 basic geometric shapes that interact with each other. The way these 2 forms come together and converse determines the experiential expression. The shapes need to be equal in the work. One cannot be dominant over the other. And they need to be clearly defined through volume and the interior of the work. If the work has a dominant shape, the other shape will become inconsequential. Then the work will either be overly sentimental or a static, intellectual statement. In other words, it will be boring. It will not reveal self or expand levels of consciousness. Art is not about duplicating an idea or an emotion. It is about the places where ideas and emotions come together. Musicians understand that great music doesn't happen in the notes or in the chords, not in the melody or in the harmony. It happens in the pause between the notes, in the silence. Sculpture is similar. Expression does not come from the triangle or the oval. It occurs at the interstices of planes. That's where the dialogue begins. Chapter 5. Love was the most difficult thing I had ever known. During the first 2 years of teaching, I questioned it often. I loved my husband, our kids, our dogs. I loved my work, and I loved my students. My entire mindset was about giving to my love, but I couldn't freeze frame them or the constant energy of giving and take the rest that I needed. I was working on a piece trying to understand love, how to hold it and find solace within it. I found only that the connection we strive for when we love, the touching beyond body and into soul, was impossible for me. I could try to touch, try to know love, but the effort I made only determined the depth of my involvement and the quality of fleeting moments. Love isn't fixed or solid. It requires work, struggle and desire, hope and memory, a momentary pause and intimacy, then the effort to go again, fight again, touch again, and dream again. I realized why my father never told me what the best meant. He couldn't. The best is never good enough because when you attain it, or think you attain it, it vanishes, only to appear elsewhere, reminding you of the other things you want, another desire, another moment. There is only the reaching in the process. At that point in my life, I did not love process. I was too busy trying to get somewhere and trying to live two lives, that of an artist and that of a mother and a wife. I wanted to push through to an end, a desired outcome. I wanted to sculpt every day in a light-filled room with flowers and wooden floors. I wanted to hear my children laughing as they played with my husband and come out at the end of the day to see a clean house and happy people. I knew it was idealistic, but the fantasy was my escape. We had moved, and my new studio was tiny, an old one-car garage filled with cobwebs and poor lighting. It leaned slightly to one side, and I worried that a strong wind would knock it down. My children needed me all the time. My husband worked, played computer games, and wanted a wife who would comfort and care for him, bake things, clean house, and at night put a loving head on his shoulder. I was constantly torn between loves. If I gave my energy to my husband and my children, then they became the dominant focus, and I was lost. If I gave my energy to my art and myself, then my family was lost. There was no balance. My life was an either-or situation, and I was trying not to choose, trying to bridge the gap with love. I believe my father had lived two lives. In one, he had a wife, children, and a group of regular friends. In the other, he had a mistress, a book, and a nightclub. Twilight was his favorite time of day. He had a cream-colored Oldsmobile with black velour seats that he loved to drive. He would take me driving at twilight through the silent streets of Santa Fe, down Canyon Road and around the plaza, up Sirius Road and left on St. Mike's, past Hardee's and the hospital, and down again on Old Santa Fe Trail. We would drive in silence. There was an unspoken code against speaking. We listened to John Coltrane on the 8-track player and watched through the car windows as people turned into shadows and lights came on. I wanted to be in the houses where light shone warm in the ghostly blue of the night. I wanted to be where there was life and warmth, laughter coming from kids running down the hall, Star Trek on TV, and the aroma of a cooking dinner wafting from the kitchen. Bathwater would be filling the tub, soft and steamy hot. Instead, I sat in the car, my head not high enough to touch the headrest, my body against black velour, inhaling secondhand smoke from the Lucky Strike cigarette burning against my father's fingers. During these rides, I was a silhouette, a shadow of myself, watching my father at the moment when his conflicting worlds disappeared and he could be quiet. I wanted him to talk to me and ruffle my hair so I could speak and be myself. But in that car, when day was turning to night, he was beyond my reach, his thumb tapping on the wheel to a beat I couldn't follow. There was no possibility of the connection I longed for, of the passing of heart into action and mind into words. I wanted to go home, to stop him from disappearing, and to see him display the passion, even if it was directed against me, that made him beautiful. And yet, I never spoke during those times, and I never turned down the opportunity to ride with him. I thought if I declined his offer, he wouldn't love me anymore. And I thought that if I spoke and broke that silence, he would revoke my privilege to bear witness to his silent reverie. For 2 years, I listened to Coltrane every night while I worked and tried to understand love. I didn't even like the music. It was melodramatic, raucous, and disturbing, but I listened. I played it as I took my sculpture up and through and down and up again, played it while I tried to understand why my life was split in two. I didn't know I was trying to break beyond the silence of twilight through the violent movement of my fingers working the wax. I didn't know that every time I cut and added, cleaned or modeled, broke a plate or defined one, I was playing to the silence of my father driving his car. I had recreated that wall between my father and myself in the prison of my marriage, and I wanted out. I wanted to hit someone, scream out loud, cry, love and be loved, or at least laugh with someone. I wanted to be home in warm yellow light. But I could not let go of either of my lives, and I was having difficulty living the twilight time in between. I thought of crosses, of sacrifice, of the moment when different worlds meet to create a new form of chaos. I loved the idea of the cross, of tension inherent in its form. It framed the collision of two worlds where lives that coexist in union and despair come together or fall apart. What I discovered was that a cross is not a shape, nor can it become a form. The cross is a symbol, sometimes hope, sometimes power, but it's never its own entity. It is only a representation of coexistence. The cross is a dream, a romance or an ideal, an ambition or desire. The junction between its lines was the determination of my future. I called my newest piece Cross to Bear. It had taken months to complete, and I had needed to kill it twice before it took on a form that spoke to me. I had tried to make an actual cross out of figures. In one version, a male figure held a woman across his knees. In another, he held her across his chest. When I finally finished the piece, it didn't look like a cross at all. But there was a cross nonetheless. It was an internal cross, manifested through volume, points of light, and intersecting planes. The piece itself was rectangular, with an oval for its secondary form. Cross to Bear was an excuse for my marriage. Through it, I had the realization that the safety and security inherent in a long-term relationship gave rise to the need to create separate, yet equal identities. I had sought to recreate through the course of my marriage the mirrors that let me see the picture of myself I had carried since childhood. Without mirrors, I lacked the courage to see myself directly. Instead, I saw a reflection of the persona I had tried to create through the eyes of the man I thought I loved. But somewhere in the process of my marriage, the reflection ceased to be adequate. I got lost in my family, in financial obligations and cleaning house. My future disappeared. I lost the shape of myself. I was again a shadow. I realized that my mother had been shadow-like as well, sifting slowly across my moments of light, always in the background, at a soccer game, a sheeted ghost at Halloween, running back and forth between the nightclub and the bookkeeping office. She had been present in my life, but as someone to avoid, to never emulate, to ridicule and fight against. She wore turtlenecks and had short hair. She seldom laughed. She was a small figure, hunched against a noisy light. Yet I saw her beauty. Beneath her olive skin, strained pale with exhaustion, there were traces of wealth, sophistication, and confidence. I never truly knew my mother, except through the accusations of a screaming man desperate to defend his infidelities. "Hey kids, who do you think is brighter, your mother or me?" he asked sarcastically during one of their fights. Sometimes he would look at us while they fought and say, "When was the last time you heard her laugh?" Or, "Women can't be artists. The only creative thing they'll ever produce is what comes out between their fucking legs." Helplessly, we watched as my mother's lips would tighten, heard the lines setting more firmly in an already rigid face, confirming to me my father's conviction that she was uptight and needed to be more for him so that he wouldn't have to have a mistress or stay at the club all night and come home drunk and stoned. One night, my father hit my mother. My sister, brother, and I were home alone sleeping when we heard a crash, followed by moaning and crying. My sister and I came out of our room to see what the matter was and saw him dragging my mother into the house by one arm. She was bloody. We wanted to call an ambulance. We wanted to clean her up. I was crying and my sister was yelling, her tears pooling at the corner of her eyes, her face rigid and tight like my mother's. My father wouldn't let us help her. As he yelled, we backed into our room. He followed us in, slamming the door behind him. He told us not to worry, to stay there and to mind our own business. And then he turned to leave. He couldn't open the door. He was too angry to remember that our door had to be pulled to be open. So he pushed the door through the frame, splintering the wood. We huddled in our beds, terrified of a raging man from whom we only wanted silence, and isolated from a broken mother who we thought was dying. In the morning, he was gone. We sponged our mother's face, rubbed toothpaste in her mouth, and eased her into the bathtub, hoping she would feel better. "Thank you," she said weakly. "You were right. I do feel better." I loved her then, but only for a moment. I thought she was the problem. Why my father wouldn't write, why he needed to be gone, why he raged and screamed and watched long hours of television naked on his bed. I thought she was his cross to bear. Until I worked on Cross to Bear, I believed that my marriage was not working because I wasn't good enough, because I was too much of a misfit to do anything right. I had given into bankruptcy, broken furniture, and holes in the walls because my husband could not live with a working wife. I once fixed a screen door with leftover parts to save money, but he just laughed at my workmanship and asked me why I had even bothered when I knew I couldn't do it right. I stopped trying to fix things. Then he complained they were broken. Through the years of my marriage, I tried to be all the things I thought my mother was not, and still, I failed. Cross to Bear was an attempt to understand the mystery of marriage and a way to continue to hold it sacred without losing my newfound self-awareness. Because we were each other's crosses to bear, we had the possibility of a shared future. I needed to believe that our discontent was merely the byproduct of our growth. I wanted my marriage to work. I did not know who I was without it. Over time, I recognized myself outside the circumstance of my marriage. My no became as powerful as my husband, and my yes was more often for myself. The cross to bear is that which reveals us to ourselves. Christ could not recognize or accept himself as the Son of God until he carried his cross. We carried our marriage like a cross. Through that process, I had discovered my voice and a method for living. My husband had discovered the internet. There were nights when we did not speak at all, and nights when he tried to reach me by coming into the studio while I worked. I no longer had room for him. 3 years of bruised hands, aching shoulders, and emotional self-examination had moved me further than I cared to explain to him. I felt as though I had launched myself down a mine shaft in a cart that I didn't have the ability to steer. Rushing through the dark tunnel, I caught glimpses of things in the air and on the rock walls. I was terrified, yet exhilarated. I felt more alive than I had ever been in my life. Some nights I would cry as I worked. Burning tears streamed down my face and wax stung my eyes. I cried not out of grief or joy, but because emotionally the art was overpowering. It was too much, too fast, as tangled memories and flashing images rushed over me. My languages failed in the moment, leaving me only the tears and the desire to express what I thought I had seen. The marriage was no longer enough. The junction between lines was the determination of my future, and the junction between my husband and me was well below the center of our cross. I was angry and disgusted with my husband. I had changed, but the routines had not. I felt he had never wanted to know me. He only wanted me to live according to his definition of how life was supposed to be. I blamed him for my conflict and didn't want him to touch me. I wanted to know myself as separate and whole, as a unique form that was equally valid, equally strong, and that could not be lost in the shadow of someone else. I was building a wall between us as I recreated myself. Instead of finding synthesis in my life, I had found that I had to make a choice because I could no longer be who I once was. I had to choose who I wanted to be and how I wanted to live. I started working on a sculpture about being alone.